This area is off limits, Mr. Four-star General's funeral. No pass, no entry. The security officer spoke in a clipped tone, hardly glancing at the elderly man in a washed-out jacket. It was as if he were invisible, just some forgotten relic from another time. And on that crisp autumn morning, he seemed so out of place. Hook 1. Nobody expected him to show up. Hook 2. Nobody guessed he could bring the entire ceremony to a halt. Inside the high iron gates, everything sparkled with military precision. Cameras clicked in waves, uniforms were pressed to an immaculate sheen, and rows of flags shimmered against the light. Crowds of dignitaries stood by, waiting to honor a national hero, General Patrick M. Gautier, a legendary figure known for leading joint operations across continents for decades. Meanwhile, the old man outside held a withered rose in one hand. He neither protested nor pleaded. He merely waited, as though content to remain unseen. But someone inside noticed. Welcome to Grateful Journeys, where stories of gratitude, loyalty, and courage come alive. This tale begins at Redwood Garrison in Tennessee, under a sky of hazy silver. The air carried the bite of early fall, a gentle breeze ruffling the row of American flags posted along the winding path. Each standard fluttered in a way that seemed to whisper a soft, mournful note. Beneath that solemn canopy, the funeral of General Gautier was about to commence. Gautier had every medal and ribbon the country could offer. Silver Star, Distinguished Service Cross, Defense Distinguished Service Medal, an endless list pinned to his name. VIPs had converged, foreign attachés, cabinet members, top brass from every branch. The security was so tight that even former officers were screened multiple times. If you didn't appear on the master list, you simply didn't get in, and that was final. Albert Carson, in his late 70s, was not on any list. His uniform, though meticulously pressed, had lost the luster of its original forest green, fading now to a bluish gray. The stitching was tight, almost ceremonially neat, but the color showed the passing of decades. On one shoulder was a faint Phantom Division patch, barely visible. No medals, no name tape, just that single insignia. Under normal circumstances, no one would question a uniform at a funeral for a highly ranked commander. But things here weren't ordinary. He'd left home early that morning, riding 2 buses and waiting in the damp chill of dawn just to get this far. He hadn't phoned for access or tried to reach out to the funeral committee. He didn't walk up demanding attention. All he wanted was a moment to say goodbye to an old comrade. "You can't come in, sir," repeated the uniformed guard in a stern voice. "This is private, authorized personnel and family only." Albert's gaze held steady, pale blue eyes crusted with age but still quietly determined. "I served with him," he said softly. "A long time ago." The guard shook his head. "I understand, sir. But if you're not cleared..." Albert merely took a step to the side. No fuss, no complaint. He lowered his head, clutching that wilted rose as if it were his only shield against the world. The guard ushered everyone else inside, finalizing checks, scanning badges, guiding them swiftly through the gates. And there stood Albert Carson, alone, each breath visible in that cooling air. All around him, the ceremony began with solemn band music, the steady rhythm of boots on gravel, and the echo of muffled drumbeats. The formal ritual of a 4-star general's farewell was unfolding within that iron enclosure, complete with precision rifle squads and a sea of crisp salutes. He could have turned away. No one expected him to stay. No one particularly cared that he did, yet he stood firmly, as though summoned by an unspoken promise. The wind lifted the corners of his jacket, rustling the single patch on his sleeve. Inside the gates, in the front row, the highest officers formed. There stood General Sterling Norris, overseeing the entire event, with a keen eye on the casket draped in the flag. Not far off, Colonel Howard Briggs adjusted his collar, scanning the crowd for final confirmations. Distant murmurs drifted from the press enclave, cameras angled for their perfect shot. From behind a wrought iron fence, the colonel's attention flickered to the older man outside. That uniform, faded or not, the patch screamed a story seldom told. Phantom Division, a Vietnam-era reconnaissance unit that never officially existed. Briggs narrowed his eyes, scanning his memory. Then a jolt of recognition hit him like a sudden chill. He'd heard rumors. An entire squad that carried out hidden missions. Only a few from that division were known to have survived. Briggs turned toward General Norris. "Sir," he said, his voice low, "we have a situation." "What kind?" asked Norris, eyes still fixed on the formalities in progress. Briggs inched closer. "There's a man at the gate. I think it's..." Just then the hush of the funeral parted like a veil, as the band struck a subdued chord. Taps would be next. The subtle shift in atmosphere made it momentarily impossible to speak further. The colonel swallowed, waiting for the right moment to break the news. Huck 3. Within minutes, an unexpected move would upend the entire ceremony.
Far outside, Albert Carson stared through those metal bars. He could see the silhouettes of uniformed soldiers, hear the echo of prayers. In the distance, the flag hung still in the windless air. Though they wouldn't let him any closer, that didn't matter. He had come to pay respects, not to make demands. This was between him and General Patrick M. Gautier, the man who once shared a battlefield with him in a place and time most had already cast aside. A series of rifles fired in measured salutes, once, twice, 3 times, each shot cracking through the morning calm. Carson lowered his eyes, remembering other times gunfire filled the sky, times when bullets weren't blank and the stakes were all too real. Suddenly, a ripple in the crowd formed inside the gates, uniforms shifted, and the honor guard parted. General Norris broke ranks, walking purposefully toward the boundary. Younger officers watched in astonishment. Even the Secretary of Defense, standing next to the funeral canopy, turned in curiosity. Albert stood motionless as General Norris approached, the bars of the gate between them. Then, in front of camera lenses and live news coverage, Norris did something no one expected. He lifted his right hand to his brow in a crisp, solemn salute, offered not to the ceremony behind him, but to the solitary figure standing outside. And just like that, the entire funeral paused. The press zoomed in. Officers murmured, confused. A hush swept over the crowd as General Norris opened the gate himself. The metallic creak sliced through the silence. Moments later, he stepped outside to face Albert Carson. "Sir," Norris uttered, addressing Albert like a peer. "On behalf of General Gautier, I've been waiting." Carson looked confused, glancing at the lines of official vehicles, the cameras, and the hundreds of spectators. "I don't understand," he managed, voice subdued. Norris gestured to Colonel Briggs, who walked up carrying a rectangular wooden case. Polished mahogany glinted in the sun. At that sight, Carson's breath caught in his throat. He recognized it immediately. An urn. Briggs offered the box to Albert with a reverent bow. "General Gautier's last wish was that you be the one to escort him home," Norris said quietly. "If you're willing." A strangled gasp escaped Albert's lips. His hold on the rose faltered. Inside that box lay the ashes of Patrick M. Gautier, the same man the nation was honoring as a hero. Carson swallowed hard, hardly believing he had been chosen for such an honor. He struggled to form words. I had no idea." At a nod from Norris, the crowd inside parted further, making a path from the gate to the memorial canopy. Cameras whirred, and reporters whispered, but not one dared intrude. Even the Secretary of Defense stood aside, arms folded. A row of senior officers, men and women with rows of ribbons on their chests, drew to attention. They turned in unison, facing Albert Carson, and from the corner of the field, a small cluster of veterans, old silver-haired men in weathered caps, rose to attention. They'd served in clandestine missions years ago, men whose service rarely made official records. One by one, they pressed shaky hands to their foreheads in silent salute. Carson hesitated. Then, summoning a quiet resolve, he extended both hands, gently taking the urn from Colonel Briggs. He stepped forward into Redwood Garrison National Cemetery, cradling the remains of a man once thought unreachable, a man to whom he had a debt of shared memories and unspoken brotherhood. Officers stepped aside to let him through, and nobody questioned it. In that moment, rank and medals didn't matter. Only gratitude. Only recognition long overdue for someone who had stood in the shadows for too many years. As the hush blanketed the gathering, Albert Carson reflected on the day he first crossed paths with Patrick Gautier. It was 1968, or maybe 69. Date uncertain, location fuzzy. The place was labeled Mantu Outpost. The conflict was vicious, rife with nightly ambushes that tested men's souls. And in the swirl of that chaos, a young lieutenant named Gautier had come dangerously close to never seeing another dawn. Carson closed his eyes. He could almost smell the damp jungle soil, the scent of smoke trailing from half-buried artillery. He felt the adrenaline spike, the weight of a wounded comrade draped over his shoulder as he ducked behind shredded sandbags. That was the night he pulled Gautier out of the line of fire. The night both men realized how single moments can fuse lives together forever. Now, decades later, with cameras recording the ceremony's every shift, Carson stood in front of a draped casket belonging to one of the most decorated generals in modern history, holding the man's ashes in his arms. A hush hovered as Albert Carson crossed that threshold, urn in hand, following General Norris. A network of crisp uniforms lined the aisle, parted just for him. An honor guard stood at the far end, rifles at rest. Each soldier, from junior NCOs to colonels with braided epaulets, quietly observed this unexpected arrival. The midday sun cut through drifting clouds, throwing thin rays onto rows of gravestones. As Carson advanced deeper into the cemetery, the rose he carried slipped from his grasp. He stooped to retrieve it, nearly fumbling the box of ashes, but a steady hand from Colonel Briggs kept it from tumbling. Then the ceremony resumed as if unpaused. A subtle motion of gloved hands signaled the bugler to continue, releasing those slow, mournful notes of taps into the brisk air. The melody sank into every listener's core, an echo of finality. Even beyond the iron gate, drivers who had paused outside stood with bowed heads. Albert sensed a tremor in his chest, recalling the first time he'd heard that melody in the thick of a jungle outpost, the day they lost 3 men from his old platoon. The memory lingered, rutted terrain, limbs trembling from fatigue, but hearts still forging ahead. Colonel Briggs cleared his throat, leaning in. "There's a seat for you, sir, near the family," he offered. Carson shook his head. "I'll stand," he answered. "Always have." Moments later, the casket draped in the stars and stripes was eased onto a raised platform. A hush spread down every row. General Norris stepped next to the microphone with measured composure, but he couldn't help stealing a glance at Carson, who remained to one side. In that look flashed an unspoken vow. This day belonged to both men now. "Friends, colleagues, and esteemed guests," Norris began in a steady, measured voice, "we gather to remember General Patrick M. Gautier, a man whose service speaks for itself. His accolades are too many to list. But there is a story, one that's never been spotlighted." His gaze wandered again toward the old soldier. That's because the man who might have told it always refused any spotlight. A wave of muted curiosity washed across the crowd. Camera lenses shifted, and a swirl of voices quieted. Even the gentle breeze seemed to pause. Norris continued, "Before we proceed with final honors, we must acknowledge a debt. Years ago, in the thick of combat, Gautier came close to never making it home. Today, the one who saved him stands among us." Albert felt the attention pivot. He lowered his gaze, tightening his hold on the urn. Though he wanted to slip away, he didn't move. An unexpected voice, strong and confident, rose behind him. "He's the reason so many of us got back." Carson turned slightly. It was Major Diane Wu, recognized for leading specialized rescue missions in later conflicts. She stood at the edge of the assembly, posture erect. "He taught entire squads how to survive, even if they never knew his name," she said simply. Stirrings of emotion rippled through the onlookers. For an instant, a younger lieutenant rubbed tears from his eyes. Beyond the main canopy, a small group of aged veterans nodded, remembering training sessions in remote outposts. Each had their own quiet memory of Carson's instructions, how he'd taught men to move silently through dense brush, or find fresh water in the most barren ravines. Hook. But was this solitary figure finally ready to reveal his past? Norris gathered his composure, returning to protocol. "We'll proceed with the gun salute, then the final act of interment. As per General Gautier's instruction, the remains will rest here, a place of honor, but only once they have been entrusted first to the man who saved his life." Heads turned, focusing on Carson. "Albert," Norris said, addressing him with quiet respect, "when you're ready, please come forward. We have a place prepared." Colonel Briggs nodded toward a short walkway of newly laid stone, leading to a freshly dug plot under a towering elm. A polished stand awaited the urn, flanked by 2 unlit candles. Carson inhaled slowly. A swirl of images returned, uninvited. The churned mud of a distant conflict, gunfire splitting the night, the weight of unconscious soldiers on his shoulders. He saw Gautier's young face, pale and bleeding, eyes full of disbelief that someone actually came back for him. Though every step felt heavy, Carson moved toward the stand, heart pounding. If not for the colonel's gentle guidance, he might have stumbled. Yet in his silence lay a gritty resolve. He arrived at the designated spot, placing the urn down with trembling care. Sunlight reflected off the polished wood, flickering across the faces of those who watched. For a moment, nobody moved. Then a single muffled shot punctured the stillness. The gun salute began its measured rhythm. A swirl of parted clouds allowed a beam of pure light to fall through, illuminating the urn. 21 times the rifles fired into the sky, each volley an echo of sacrifice. By the final shot, a hushed reverence returned. Carson stood immobile, eyes on the ashes, the rose clasped to his chest. Only when General Norris stepped to his side did he glance away. The general's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "He left a note for you, along with instructions for this day." At the mention of a note, Albert grew tense. The letter from Gautier had been mentioned in passing once before, yet he'd never believed it would surface. "Show me," he said, not as an order but as a plea. Norris produced a small weathered envelope stamped with official seals. Carson noticed the off-white paper had begun to yellow, as though time itself wanted to claim the secret. He reached out, but Norris's hand paused. "Read it whenever you feel you can," he said gently. "He trusted you more than anyone." Another surge of memory tugged at Carson. How many times had he brushed aside Gautier's thanks, acting like his rescue was no big deal? How often had he dodged the cameras, the praise, the formality? Now, it was all colliding here, on this hallowed ground. The aged soldier slid the envelope into his jacket pocket, words forming in his mind but refusing to pass his lips. Cameras rolled in the backdrop, capturing the swirl of uniformed officials, the bright flags, and the hush blanketing them all. Suddenly, a hush that felt almost fragile took hold. Taps would be played once more, concluding the formalities. Chaplains stood by. Mourning families shifted in their seats, children peeking out from behind solemn adults. Even those who didn't know Gautier personally seemed affected by the raw devotion unfolding around Carson. They saw not just a funeral but a bond that had survived decades, rooted in acts that rarely make headlines. And as the next bugle note prepared to break that stillness, nobody could predict what Albert Carson would do next, or what he'd finally reveal after all those silent years. The entire gathering seemed to wait, breath suspended in collective expectation. A lone bugle call fractured the silence. The notes drifted over the stone markers,
touching every folded flag and every grief-worn face. Albert Carson stood rooted by the fresh grave, the letter still hidden in his coat pocket. His mouth felt dry, filled with words he couldn't shape. He wanted to walk away, vanish like he did decades ago, slip into the unknown. But something held him there, tethered by memory. He glanced at General Norris, then at the men in uniform. Soon, he would have to decide, speak or remain buried in silence. Even at this solemn juncture, the outside world pressed close. The newspapers, the camera crews, they wanted a story. He had carried secrets for a lifetime, held them under lock and key because people like him rarely told their tales. Yet one glance at the polished urn reminded him, there comes a time to break that lock. Sergeant Carson, someone called from behind. He pivoted to see Major Wu stepping forward, her expression tinged with gentle urgency. Before we finish, the family would like to honor you. They lost a father and husband, but they also know he survived countless missions because of you. Carson's gaze settled on Gautier's wife, stoic behind sunglasses, her hands clutching a flag the honor guard had just folded. She offered him a nod, as if acknowledging all the unspoken moments bridging her life and his. A swirl of conflicting emotions rose in Carson. Respect, duty, and an old feeling he rarely let surface. Acceptance. He inched forward, mindful of the onlookers, until he stood near the widow and her grown son. Their eyes glimmered with sorrow. The widow reached out, a quiet gratitude in her trembling hand. He mentioned you so many times, she whispered. Said you were the reason he got to come home and be a father. Her voice cracked. I never got to thank you. Carson's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, he bowed in silent acknowledgement. The rose he held, still wilted, passed from his palm into hers, a subtle gesture from one keeper of memories to another. From the rear of the gathering, camera shutters resumed their fluttering staccato, eager to capture a private exchange. At once, Colonel Briggs turned sharply, raising a hand at the journalists. Discreetly, he signaled for them to lower their lenses, and most complied. They seemed to sense that not every moment was meant for the headline reel. May took a step closer, quiet words only Carson could hear. You can talk to them if you want. Let the public know who you are. He stared at the small penned name on the casket's corner. I'm nobody special. That's not how the general saw it, she countered softly. The hush clung to the ceremony, thick as the crisp autumn air. An army chaplain moved to the podium, preparing to lead the final prayer. On some silent cue, Colonel Briggs signaled the color guard to present arms. Rifles lifted to the sky, each soldier straightened with precise discipline. The chaplain, a tall figure in a dark uniform, faced the crowd. Gracious Lord, he began, voice clear, we lay this hero to rest, accompanied by those who served alongside him. Teach us to remember quietly, and live kindly, in honor of unseen sacrifices. Carson's jaw tightened. That single word, unseen, plucked a buried chord inside him. Flashes returned, him wading through swampy fields under moonlight, one hand dragging a wounded private, the other clutching a battered rifle. He remembered crouching behind a fallen palm, Gautier's shallow breathing, the only sign he was still alive. How many times had they escaped with seconds to spare? The chaplain concluded with the final benediction, and for a moment the entire gathering exhaled. Some turned to leave, heading toward the cluster of official vehicles. Others milled about, exchanging hushed condolences. Carson stood still, scanning the men and women in uniform. A few yards away, a small group of older soldiers observed him. They bore scattered ribbons on their chests, tokens from foreign wars. He nodded in recognition, and they nodded back, a silent salute. Each had a story that seldom found speech. General Norris reappeared, stepping gingerly over the neatly trimmed grass, until he reached Carson's side. He lowered his voice, glancing around to ensure some measure of privacy. I know you don't want publicity, he said, but there's a reception by the old canteen hall. The family offered to set out a place for you if you want to share even a few words. Carson flicked his gaze to the letter in his pocket. I should probably read this first. Norris detected the hesitation in his voice. Take any space you need. The chaplain's tent is empty. Use it if you like. Carson nodded. Already he felt the weight of a lifetime. Then he took a step toward the chaplain's tent, weaving through the dispersing crowd. The tent was modest and bare. A single table draped in a white cloth. A folding chair waited, as though placed just for him. He settled into it carefully, pulling the envelope from his jacket. Smoothing the paper, he stared at Gautier's scrawling signature across the flap. For a moment the cemetery's sounds faded. Footsteps, subdued conversation, the rustle of flags. All that remained was the pounding of his own pulse, like an echo from far-off times. Slowly, he broke the seal. A single sheet of lined stationery slid out, worn at the edges, bearing the same angled handwriting. Albert, you'll never let me repay you. But maybe there's a reason you showed up when the world wasn't looking. I hope someday you'll stand in the light you deserve. You saved my life more than once. Let me honor you at least this way. If you're reading this, it means you came back. So please stick around. I need you for one final mission. Patrick. Carson exhaled, his chest nodding. That last line was Gautier's playful phrase from decades ago. One final mission, he used to say whenever he convinced their ragged unit to push through enemy territory one more time. A footstep rustled the grass outside the tent. Colonel Briggs stood there, arms at his sides, expression gentle. Mind if I come in? Carson reached up, dabbing at the corner of his eye, his voice cracking with the weight of memory. I'm good, just needed a moment. Briggs cleared his throat. The general's family wants you to know. The next part of the ceremony is optional. The press will be there, but if you want to reveal who you are, I've got clearance to let you address them. Briggs, he said, steadying his tone. There's a lot they never knew. About him. About me. Then maybe it's time, Briggs offered quietly.
Outside, the gentle mask of afternoon sun lit the cemetery. Soldiers were cleaning up, removing chairs, gathering programs left on seats. The flurry buzzed, but around the tent, a hush remained. Carson rose, feeling an old ache in his knees. Gautier's words echoed in his mind. Stick around. He peered at the exit. A mild wind lifted the flap, offering a glimpse of the rows of white headstones and the quiet devotion still painted on the gathered faces. He inhaled once, searching for courage he didn't know he possessed. He parted the flap and stepped out, determined at last to face the welcome and the scrutiny that might greet him. Albert Carson emerged from the chaplain's tent, suppressing the knot in his throat. Streaks of afternoon sun cut lines across the grass, illuminating the solemn reality of the day. The casket had been lowered now, only the brightly folded flag visible above ground. A uniformed color guard held formation nearby, while small clusters of mourners slowly drifted toward the parking area. As Carson took a step forward, Colonel Briggs paced silently at his side, granting him a protective presence. From across the field, Major Wu motioned discreetly for him to come forward. Beyond her stood a makeshift podium set up near the canteen hall, a low, white-weathered building used for small receptions. Carson briefly scanned the crowd. It was a quieter group now, a handful of senior officers, Gautier's family, and a few who must have been longtime friends. The cameras were still there, perched at the edge, yet the overall density of reporters had thinned. A chill wrapped around Carson's shoulders. He wasn't accustomed to eyes turning his way, and sure enough, the approach of his figure drew a mild stir of whispers, as if people weren't quite sure what to expect from a man who had hidden in plain sight all these years. Over here, Sergeant, Major Wu said gently, guiding him by a light touch on the elbow. The rest of the ceremony is informal. They'd like you to say something, if you're willing. Carson felt an unrelenting sense of apprehension. For decades, he had dodged questions, and never once gave a full explanation of his role in the Phantom Division. The idea of delivering remarks felt as foreign as stepping onto a stage in front of thousands. But remembering Gautier's letter, he recalled the urgency in that final mission call, a summons to share a piece of the truth. He approached the podium. The battered wood reminded him of an aging footlocker he once used in a faraway base. Scratches and faded paint told their own silent history. A microphone stood at chest height, old-fashioned, no fancy electronics. Beyond it, the modest courtyard spread out, sprinkled with chairs no one quite knew how to occupy. Some simply stood. Others, especially younger soldiers, lingered near the back, perhaps unsure about listening in on a personal tribute. Carson cleared his throat, bracing the podium with both hands, hoping the gesture might ground him. Colonel Briggs hung close by, ready to handle any abrupt disruptions. A hush descended, broken only by the distant hum of departing vehicles. Gautier's widow, flanked by her son, settled into the front row. Major Wu took a seat beside them, arms folded in respectful attention. General Norris stood off to the side, gaze lowered as though giving Carson the floor free of intimidation. For an instant, Carson said nothing. Instead, he stared at the simple microphone, searching his mind for the words that refused to form. Memories poured in. Nights under mortar fire, scorching days in the jungle, the snap of a branch that might trigger an ambush. He couldn't believe he now stood in front of a funeral crowd, about to speak on behalf of a departed friend. He paused. I don't know what I could say that General Gautier hasn't already shown us with his life. The timid amplifier made his voice crackle. He was brave, sure. Everybody knows that much. He drew a breath, but that wasn't what defined him. A small shift rippled among the audience. At the back, a lieutenant in a dress uniform listened closely, the brim of his cover shading his eyes. A whir of a camera lens refocused near the courtyard's edge, but Carson paid it no mind. When I first met Patrick Gautier, he said, carefully pronouncing the name, he was barely even a lieutenant. We crossed paths on an impossible mission, one that none of us thought we'd survive. But somehow, his voice trailed off as a memory seized him. Somehow we both pulled through, and it changed everything I believed about family.
He hesitated, noticing the widow lower her head. Her son placed a hand around her shoulders. Carson exhaled slowly. That family wasn't built by blood, he continued, more quietly. We were just kids, thrown into a place where bullets and mortar shells replaced mornings at a desk. We had to rely on each other to come out whole. And that's what General Gautier never forgot, that bond. Carson glanced at the letter reaching past the lining of his pocket. It wasn't about the medals for him, he said, voice nearly cracking. They mattered, sure, but not the way folks think. Behind every commendation there were faces of people on that mission, men and women who bled to keep others safe. He paused, scanning the crowd as he realized a hush had settled like a thick blanket. His heart pounded. Some of us got recognized, others didn't. He broke off, grappling with words he'd buried forever. Those nameless do exist. I lived in that space a long time where you can't really talk about what you did or saw. I guess I still am. An unexpected wave of emotion tightened his throat. Briefly, he averted his gaze to reorient himself. Then his eyes found Gautier's widow again. She offered him a trembling smile that conveyed she understood. Carson inhaled, letting the crisp air ground him. I'm not much for speeches. I never wanted to overshadow the people who truly gave everything. But Patrick didn't let me stay hidden. Not today. He noticed Colonel Briggs shift in place as though bracing for a confession never heard aloud. Journalists inched closer. Microphones extended without intruding too far. Carson straightened. Since the moment I carried him off that field, he carried me in his heart, wrote me letters I never answered, invited me to his promotions I never attended, and he never held it against me. He just waited for this day, I guess. His voice quivered at the final phrase. The crowd was silent, absorbing the raw sincerity. Even the young soldiers who might have come with curiosity or half distraction were fully alert now. And so, he gestured to the folded flag draped near the casket. I can't do anything else but honor him. Honor the others we lost. Honor those who never got a single line in a newspaper. So many men and women gave their bodies, their minds, their future, so we could stand right here and bury our heroes with dignity. Carson swallowed, barely containing the tears that threatened to break free. He stepped back, gripping the edges of the podium. For a moment no one moved. Then General Norris, his voice measured, broke through. Thank you, Sergeant, he said. The legacy you share is one we all must remember. At Norris's subtle signal, scattered applause fluttered from the back rows, and rose gradually, not boisterous and loud, but respectful, warm, a salute in the form of clapping hands. Each patter felt like a small exhale, a show of solidarity. Carson nodded, stepping away from the microphone, not trusting his voice further. Major Wu came forward while the applause still lingered, offering him a discreet handshake. Though the cameras hovered, they seemed mindful enough to keep distance, capturing images without searing bright lights or incessant shudders. He gave one last glance to the flag, to the casket resting behind it. In the corner of his eye, he spotted Colonel Briggs offering a respectful half-smile, an acknowledgement that sometimes the hardest battles are fought far from the battlefield. Outside the canteen's open doors, a modest buffet awaited the mourners. Subtle fragrances of coffee and warm soup drifted in the crisp air. Gautier's family would gather there, and lines of uniforms would form. Condolences would be shared. Tears might fall in privacy. Carson felt in the deepest sense that the real test was about to start. This was the realm where people asked questions. Where did you serve? How did you know him? Will you share a story or two? And as he slowly made his way toward those doors, he could almost hear Gautier's voice from ages ago. Just one more step, soldier. That's all. With that single chorus of applause gently subsiding behind him, Albert Carson crossed into the canteen hall, each footfall echoing like a promise he'd run from until now. Albert Carson entered the canteen hall with cautious steps, the muted echo of conversation guiding him toward a small cluster of round tables draped in plain linen. The glow of overhead bulbs, aged and slightly yellow, gave the space a supportive warmth. By the time he reached one of the serving tables, half the seats had filled with subdued mourners. Uniformed personnel mingled with family friends, shoulders squared or hunched in quiet reflection. He lingered a moment, letting the hum of subdued chatter flow around him. In one corner, he spotted a small display board featuring pictures of General Patrick M. Gautier through the years, West Point graduation, early platoon photos, promotion ceremonies. The captions were brief tributes to a storied career. They painted Gautier as a respected strategist, a beacon of leadership. But Carson couldn't help noticing what was missing. Images of the nights when neither side believed dawn would come, the half-forgotten scars Gautier carried long before the polished medals caught the sun. A young army specialist perched behind the photos, adjusting name placards. Her gaze flickered up when she noticed Carson. She gave a shy nod, as though recognizing him from the funeral proceedings, but unsure what to say. Carson returned the nod, wordlessly acknowledging that no pictures would ever tell the full story. He scanned the rows of tables, noticing Major Diane Wu, at one in the middle. She waved waved him over with a gentle smile, making room on a chair where the table's other occupants, older vets mostly, shifted to accommodate him. Colonel Briggs, having escorted Carson inside, quietly took a seat across, setting his cap aside. "I wasn't sure you'd join us, Sergeant," Major Wu said. "But I'm glad you did." Carson eased down. An attendant passed him a modest plate, small sandwich triangles, a spoonful of potato salad, a cup of steaming coffee. He cradled the cup in both hands, letting the heat soothe the trembling that lingered in his fingers. Nods of greeting were exchanged around the table. A gray-haired man with a deep scar across his right cheek introduced himself as Everett Childress, once an airman charged with close air support during a mission or two that Carson recalled vaguely. Childress's voice wavered when sharing how Gautier once personally checked in to ensure his rescue team got supplies. "He told me people in the back lines mattered every bit as much as those on the front," Childress recalled. "Never forgot that." Carson just listened. Every story pulled the same invisible thread that bound them all in mutual respect. He sipped coffee that tasted faintly burnt, but it didn't matter. A sense of belonging, however reluctant, found its way into that circle. From the corner of his eye, Carson caught a flicker of lenses. A press cameraman hovered discreetly by a potted plant, his equipment angled in a respectful attempt to capture glimpses without intruding. Carson felt his chest tighten slightly, but recognized no malice. Even so, he had to brace himself for a possibility he'd avoided for decades. Interviews. Recognition. Questions about operations that never made official records. Colonel Briggs tapped his knuckles lightly on the table. "They want an interview," he said under his breath, directing his gaze to the cameraman. "You can decline. Or," he let the offer hang. Carson inhaled slowly. "Let me catch my breath first," he replied. He wasn't ready to face the entire nation's curiosity. Not yet, anyway. A spattering of laughter near the refreshment line drew a glance from the group. Gautier's grown son and a few family friends were exchanging memories with an older woman who had served as the general's personal aide. The shared recollections built an air of celebration, balancing the undercurrent of grief. It reminded Carson that funerals can also be gatherings of gratefulness for what was, not just sorrow over what was lost. "You see," Major Wu ventured. Patrick's circle was wide, but he always wondered if someday you might step back in. Carson nodded. His eyes fell back to his coffee. He had never wanted to overshadow Gautier's rise through the ranks, or overshadow anything at all. In the hush of that thought, he caught Colonel Briggs's gaze, the man's expression urging him to speak those truths he'd kept locked up. "When I read his letter," Carson began softly, "it felt like he was calling me out. One last time." He swallowed the lump that wedged itself in his throat. "Calling me to stand alongside him, at least in spirit, so I could accept that part of me never left the field." A small hush drifted over the table. Even outside, the subdued chatter seemed to dip. Carson cleared his throat, forcing a steady tone. "I spent years trying not to dwell on the things I did, but Gautier, he insisted on remembering for both of us. He tracked me down, sent letters I never opened, asked me to come see him. Every time I ran." He looked up, meeting their eyes. "Guess the only place I couldn't outrun him was here." For a moment no one spoke. They just absorbed the quiet regret folded into his words. Major Wu laid a hand gently on his sleeve. "It matters that you came now," she said. A new flurry of movement near the door made them turn. Gautier's widow stepped inside, supported by her son. Heads lowered in silent respect as she passed. Her eyes were still rimmed with red, yet she carried herself with calm dignity. Catching sight of Carson, she offered a small wave of acknowledgement, as if to say, "I see you. I'm grateful." Carson returned it, unspoken understanding bridging decades of history. He set down his coffee, bracing for a possible conversation he might not be ready for, but that deep down he knew was necessary. As she drew closer, the room felt smaller, narrowing around the two of them and the stories they represented. At a table nearby, a hushed voice asked, "Is that him? The one from the gate?" Another pointed discreetly, but no one rose to swarm him as he might have feared. Instead, the atmosphere remained gentle, a tapestry of respect and mild curiosity, each person permitted to process the day's revelations at their own pace. Carson found himself exhaling in relief. This was unfamiliar but not unwelcome. And somewhere amid the quiet acceptance, a notion formed in his mind. Perhaps now, after so many years, he could lay some of his own burdens to rest. Outside the windows, late afternoon light washed the lawn in a softer glow, revealing ranks of white headstones stretching into the distance, a reflection of countless stories untold. He swallowed, glancing at Colonel Briggs, who gave him a silent nod to continue. The time had come to open another door, even if it led to answers and questions he had once tried to bury forever.